Hey guys, my name is Steve from Vorsprung Suspension in Whistler. I'm here today to show you how to install the Fox Luftkappes. There are a couple of different versions of this. There is this one here, which is for a 34 evol. There is one for a 36 evol, and there is also one for 34 NA2. The NA2 models are those from 2016 and 17. They are not retrofittable to the 2015 and earlier 34s that have been updated to the NA airspring. So if your fork went back to Fox for an airspring update, unfortunately the Luftkappe is not compatible with your fork. If you have any questions about compatibility, please don't hesitate to email us. We'll get back to you and help clarify exactly which Luftkappe you want and or whether a Luftkappe is compatible with your fork to begin with. So let's start by having a look at the tools and supplies we're going to need in order to properly install this. Now, I am going to assume that you are capable of taking the lowers off your own fork and disassembling the airspring safely. Please refer to the manufacturer's own service instructions for this. Up until the point that the Luftkappe is installed, everything is done as per manufacturer's spec. This video is going to show how to install a Luftkappe into the NA2 variant of float airspring. So these are found only in the 34 and they are from model years 2016 and 2017. Now, before we start, you'll need a few tools. First of all, Knipex or multi-grips. This is pretty much the only time it's ever acceptable to use multi-grips. In suspension servicing, we really try to avoid that. Secondly, you'll need a torque wrench and a 15mm socket. You'll need some isopropyl alcohol. You'll also need a heat gun and a vise. With your 34 NA2 kit, if you ordered with the tools, you'll receive shaft clamps, a bullet tool, you'll receive a new replacement low friction seal head, the dome for the Luftkappe, the piston for the Luftkappe, and the stud for the Luftkappe. Now we are also going to need a couple of other things. We will need clean shop towels, and we will need some blue and red Loctite. So let's get started. First step is to remove the old piston from the shaft. Basically, the way that this shaft is assembled, in this particular case, what we're going to be doing is replacing this whole stud, piston, bumper, and seal head assembly. So we're going to have to fully disassemble this shaft. We're going to have to remove the foot bolt, the foot stud from this end of the shaft. We're going to have to remove the post, the piston post, and the piston from the other end of the shaft. Now, both of these are held in with red Loctite, which means that you'll need to heat them up to break the Loctite or to soften it before you're able to clamp the shaft in the shaft clamps and undo these. Now, a note on clamping this in the shaft clamps. First of all, always clamp it as close as you can to what you're doing up or undoing without overlapping threads, because this has internal threads at this end. We don't want to be clamping right here. We need to allow an inch or so. This end here, we can clamp right up close. It's important that you use good quality shaft clamps for this. We don't want to crush the shaft, which is difficult to do in shaft clamps, but not impossible. And likewise, we don't want it to be spinning around and potentially marking the shaft. That could cause air leaks. Any work that you do on this is obviously done at your own risk. If you're not comfortable doing it yourself, please feel free to send your fork or even just the airspring assembly to us or to another authorized service center. These are fairly fragile. Everything on them is aluminium or plastic. So be careful of what you're working on. As a side note, we do not recommend the use of the Park axle vise clamps. They don't protect these from damage. If you use one of those clamps, almost guaranteed that you will damage the shaft. So the first step is to clean this shaft with isopropyl alcohol, get it nice and dry, just so the shaft clamps have something nice and dry to grip on. Then we need to mount this assembly in the vise with the shaft clamps. So this will go in the vise. Do it up firmly. You don't need to be using all of your strength to do it. We're not reusing this plastic piston. the seal or the stud. However, remember the stud is attached to the shaft with red Loctite, so we need to use the heat gun, warm it up. Warm it a bit more thoroughly. I've already warmed this one up. Next step, ideally using a set of Knipex, multi-grips if you don't have Knipex. You can grab carefully this stud around the outer rim, clamp it tightly, you'll be able to break it loose. Now remember, we're not too worried about damaging this because we're not going to reuse it. Don't damage the shaft. These we're not too worried about. Once this whole assembly has been removed, we can set it aside. We're not going to be reusing this. Now, we can turn the shaft assembly upside down, put it in the shaft clamps at the other end, repeat the same thing with this foot bolt. So remember, don't clamp too close to the end. We don't want to be clamping the actual thread that we're undoing. But we don't want to be clamping it at the far end of the shaft and bending the shaft either. So, remove this little O-ring here on the foot stud. You can do it by hand. I generally don't recommend removing O-rings with a pick unless you actually have to. You can take that off and set it aside. We'll be reinstalling this once we're done. Heat up the shaft again. Again, I've warmed this one up before. Then we can remove the foot stud. Now, we don't want to be using multi-grips for this task because we do have to reuse this. If you don't have Knipex, please use the appropriate size wrench, which is a 10mm spanner. So this is the foot bolt. You'll see we have an O-ring on here. We're going to reuse that O-ring as well. Just clean all the debris from the Loctite off there. So put this aside, we're going to reuse it. Don't lose it. So now we have bare shaft with the seal head and the top out bumper on there. Remove these entirely, set them aside. We will not be reusing these. We will, however, be reusing the shaft. Clamp this shaft in the shaft clamps once again with this end with the female thread upwards. So now we're going to use this bullet tool here to install the seal head. Now, put the bullet tool itself with the locating tab facing downwards in there. Then we have something that gives us a nice smooth surface for this to slide over. Use a generous amount of slick honey on the bullet tool all around. And then just gently work that on there. Hold the bullet tool firmly in place. Wiggle the thing down, away she goes. Nice and smooth, remove the bullet tool. Clean that up and set it aside. We don't need it again for this task. So at this point, make sure that your seal gland is clean. So we're now going to apply a small amount of red Loctite to the internal thread inside this shaft. Now it's important that the Loctite goes on the thread itself and not on the seal gland. Loctite and rubber aren't a great combination. So this is red Loctite 262. Now, wipe any excess out of the seal gland if there is any in there. In this case, there was a bit of excess Loctite in there. Now, the reason that we put the Loctite in there is because we have a seal on here. When we thread these together, we want the threads in here to be pushing the Loctite away from the seal. For this reason, we don't want to put the Loctite directly on the male thread in this case. So we can just thread this in by hand until it's engaged. Thread it in as far as it can go. You should be able to get it. If you've cleaned the Loctite off it thoroughly, you should be able to get that down until it softly bottoms out on the shaft without a tool. Now, the correct torque for this is 50 inch-pounds. So you have two options here. You can torque that immediately with a crow's foot or a torque wrench adapter, or you can torque it against the Luftkappe when we install that at the other end. We'll get to that. So with your torque wrench set to 50 inch-pounds, arrange your 12mm spanner and the torque wrench adapter at 90 degrees. It's very important that they're at 90 degrees, otherwise it will skew your torque reading. Tighten the foot bolt until it clicks, and we're good. So we need to install this with the male threads upwards and the shaft clamps in the vise. Now in this case we're going to thread this stud on as well. We need red Loctite on this thread or this thread interface. In this case there's no seal between the two, so it doesn't matter which one we put it on. I'm going to put it on the male thread simply because that's easier to get at. Take your piston stud. You have quite a bit of Loctite there. Thread the piston stud on by hand as far as it will go until it bottoms out. You don't need to tighten it just yet. Now, take the piston here. This simply slips down there. So before we thread the dome onto here, I need 1 drop of blue Loctite on this thread just here. So this is Loctite 243. We're now going to take the dome, put a tiny bit of slick honey around the inside of this because this is a sealing surface, and a tiny bit on this O-ring around here. Now don't worry about using too much slick honey, just don't get it in the Loctite. So we now want to thread this on here. So this will simply thread on by hand. That will thread down until it reaches the stop. Now this one again we are tightening to 50 inch-pounds, which is the same as that foot bolt. So if you don't have a crow's foot or a good way of using a torque wrench directly on the foot bolt, then you can tighten that against that. Now be very careful doing that, it's very easy to slip. For the time being, we're simply going to tighten this. Now you'll notice that both the dome, the piston and the stud are all turning. That's normal. Now we can remove this here. So you'll note we have no top out bumper here. The reason for this is that the top out bumper actually would take up quite a bit of space. This becomes our negative spring and our pneumatic top out. When the fork is in motion, its typical top out point will be about where it is there. When you first inflate it, before there's any air in the negative chamber, what will happen is that it will fully extend to that point there. And until you compress it far enough that this seal passes the transfer port and equalizes the pressure that's on one side of the piston here with the pressure in the negative chamber, it will be topped out, extended further than it is at its soft top out point, which should be at the correct amount of travel. For the 34 NA2 kits, you'll also have a stainless steel shim like so that goes on underneath here. Now, this shim goes between the hoopster or Spiralox ring in your lowers and the seal head. Basically just prevents the seal head getting gouged up and pushing past the retaining ring. So the last thing to do before we reinstall this in the fork is to put this little O-ring back on the foot stud here. So this slips back over. Obviously be careful not to damage it. Make sure everything is clean. Once it's safely back on there, then we're good to go. So before we reinstall this, we're simply going to apply a generous coat of slick honey. It doesn't mean dunk the whole thing in the tub, but give you some idea of what I consider acceptable. Something like that. Now you can rub a bit around the piston as well. That will push it as it contacts the stanchion. As the grease fills the gap between the piston and the stanchion, this dome will never touch the stanchion, but the grease that's sticking out a fair way from it will drag up the stanchion, and that will help lubricate everything. So plenty of slick honey. For those who are inclined, a small drop of float fluid in through the top cap afterwards doesn't hurt either. But what we want to do now is install this into the stanchion very carefully. We don't want to damage that seal. We don't want to damage anything here. Make sure we're not damaging this O-ring around the seal head. And yeah, especially not the quad ring on the piston. Once that's in, we reassemble as per normal, as per the manufacturer's instructions. So from this point forward, I would refer you back to the manufacturer's instructions on how to reassemble the fork.